Hi, Mark Gevisser. As usual, just to say we are recording this and it will be put up on the Institute for African Studies website. So if you would rather be anonymized, please switch off your cameras and don't ask a question if you're worried about your safety or things being made public. So just to be aware of that, it is being recorded. Mark Gevisser, a South African journalist and author who's written this fabulous book called The Pink Line, very ambitious book, Mark. Let me introduce you a little bit to Mark. He has spent, in fact, decades as a journalist, making South African stories accessible to South Africans, making sense of our strange, complicated country to people abroad. So those of you on this side of the world may have seen Mark's fabulous writing in places like the New York Times, still interpreting our complicated politics for everybody. His book on Thabo Mbeki, The Dream Deferred, sorry, I have a sore throat. The Dream Deferred won South Africa's Premier Prize for Nonfiction, the Alan Paton Award, a tour de force, really, but Mark's written other stuff, including a sort of memoir of his childhood, which was also a sort of memoir about Johannesburg and growing up in this divided city. The Pink Line, and Mark, that memoir, I thought of it a bit reading this book, because dispatcher, it felt again like that notion of dispatcher. In Mark's memoir, he talks about this game he used to play called Dispatcher, where he would take the telephone book, was it, Mark, and send goods around the city, it would track around the city. And it feels like here again, you're acting like a bit of a dispatcher, taking us to all these places around the world with this very complex and as I said, ambitious book, because it's not just a book about one identity, one place, one person. It's all of us implicated in these stories, seeing resonances of lives lived in multiple places. So this really wonderful idea of the pink line, which operates as a kind of as a concept of border making, ways of being on one side of the other or the other of this very shifting pink line that has specific articulations in different countries and yet has something familiarly universal about it. The concept, I think it's just really a brilliant concept, because it is able to capture this universal and particular at the same time, but drawing at the same as well on your capacity as a journalist to tell stories, talking with people and bringing those particular stories to life in this book. I'm really looking forward to a conversation about those methodologies, that concept, and what it tells us about the world we're living in now. Specifically, for me, who's been working a little bit on trying to understand right-wing populism and the idea of gender ideology, I found this a really insightful book. In conversation with Mark today is the director of the Pauline Jewett Institute for Women, Gender and Sexuality at Carleton University. I don't think we've changed the name yet, Anne, but Anne Cvetkovich is just so well poised to be an interlocutor for today. Her own work, most famously An Archive of Feelings, a book published by Duke University Press, which has made such an impact on the ways in which we take affect into account in the shaping of identities, politics, public history and space. Thank you so much for agreeing, Anne. I know you agreed last year and we didn't get the date together, but I'm glad you're here today. And then a fellow South African displaced in Canada, Jordache Ellapen, who is also based in an Institute for Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies, as well as in historical studies at the University of Toronto. Jordache's work, he's also a filmmaker, and Jordache's work is on aesthetics and on something you call Afronormativity, which I'm interested to hear more of, but on the intersections of race, gender, queerness, and politics in South Africa. So fabulous collection of people to talk to this book. We will try and make some time also for questions from all of you listening in. So Mark, I'm just going to kick this off by asking you to tell us about this idea of the pink line and the way in which you use it as a conceptual device. This seems to me methodologically a really difficult thing to pull off, and yet you do, because it's such a shifting line, right? It's a shifting notion. What is the pink line? Why is it such an illuminating device for you?
So thank you so much, Shireen. It's wonderful to be here and to be hosted by you, my old South African comrade, now across the waters in Ottawa, and making the world both bigger and smaller with an event like this. And I love that. I'm really happy to be here with you and with everybody at Carleton. I usually start explaining it in another way, but because you began with this image of the dispatcher from my previous book, Lost and Found in Johannesburg, I'm going to try and explain the pink line in a way that I haven't before. So this is a little bit of an experiment, a bit of a hothouse, but I'm really up for it, and let's see if it works. So Shireen told the story about how when I was a little boy, I used the telephone directory to find addresses all over Johannesburg, and then to dispatch goodies to people at these addresses using the map book that we had. This was, of course, before the age of GPS, and we had a sort of a cloth-bound road atlas. And I would spend hours, I think, kind of transporting myself out of the very comfortable but nonetheless oppressive confines of white apartheid middle-class South Africa by playing this game. And what happened to me once in this game, which is what the book was about, is that I found an address of a Black person in a place called Alexandria that I knew about because it was the township from which, or the Black township from which all the people who worked for us and for our friends lived, but I had no idea where it was. I had no idea where it was. And when I plotted a direction from my home on page 77 of the map book to his, let's say his name was Mr. Mofolo, on page 79, I was absolutely astonished to realize that Alexandra, this place that might as well have been on another planet, was on the next page, really just across a river, across a boundary. I was equally astonished to see that even though it was on the next page, there was no route across. There was no mapped cartographical route from where I lived in white South Africa to where Mr. Mofolo lived in Black South Africa, even though he was just on the next page. And this was really my primal understanding of apartheid that happened when I was 6 or 7 years old, playing this game, and of the border or the boundary that separated Mr. Mofolo and Alexandra and me. And in the map book, it was actually a pink line. The lines between suburbs were drawn in pink. And it got me interested in a lifelong interest in borderlands and in boundaries and in what happens on the other side, how one can get to the other side, and there is actually a transition to the other side, or whether we're all in some sort of borderland. These are lifelong conceptual questions I have had. Now, fast forward to the 21st century. And I am a man in my 40s, and I am very aware of this new global LGBT, that's what it was at the time, they weren't the Qs yet, moment, of this kind of ineluctable force that was creating this progress that was liberating people across the globe, of allegedly liberating people across the globe, a new conversation that was happening in ways that had never happened before, whether the conversation was about marriage equality in North America, or about very basic rights in countries in Africa, like Uganda. In my home country, with the end of apartheid, sexual orientation was entrenched as something against which you could not be discriminated in our constitution. Suddenly the world seemed to be talking about this. And because the world was now a shrinking world, thanks to globalization, thanks to the vectors of globalization, mass migration, to the digital revolution, of course, to commodity capitalism, it seemed like this was one story, one conversation. And yet what was clear was that there were pink lines through this, pink lines that were defining who was in and who was out, who had rights and who didn't have rights. And it seemed to me that a new pink line was being staked, that was dividing and describing the world in ways that were entirely new and that we didn't fully understand. So that, for example, in 2013, at the same time as the United Kingdom legalized same-sex marriage, Nigeria passed a prohibition of same-sex marriage act, even though nobody in Nigeria no queer people in Nigeria were even thinking about sex marriage. The queer people in Nigeria were interested in basic rights to privacy and dignity and security. But the Nigerians had decided to pass this act almost as a way of laying a pink line against the former colonial oppressor, to say, you have your way of doing things and we have our way of doing things. And what was interesting to me was the geopolitics on both sides of that pink line, whether the line was drawn between the global north and the global south, and we can talk about that a lot more in this seminar, because this is a seminar I understand primarily about issues that affect Africa, or whether the line was drawn in Europe between the European Union, which had a sort of universal human rights doctrine, which included the rights of LGBT people, and governments and countries in Eastern Europe who began to see this as an assault on their cultural sovereignty or their traditional values, led by Vladimir Putin first, and now of course we see by leaders such as Viktor Orban in Hungary. This was becoming a global discourse. And what was interesting to me about this global discourse is that queer people were being instrumentalized and weaponized far greater than really what they were looking for or asking for in terms of human rights equality. So on the one side of the pink line, they were seen as people who needed to be saved and helped, and perhaps brought over the pink line to the other side. And the whole category of LGBT refugees came about. Canada, by the way, being a major country that rescued or saved queer people in dire circumstances in other parts of the world. So that's what was happening on one side of the pink line. On the other side of the pink line, queer people were being seen as foreign agents, as some enemy from within, who had been infected or contaminated or perhaps bought by gay people in the West, and were importing these evil new secular ideas into some kind of pure or idealized African or Russian or Malaysian society. And a line had to be drawn to keep these bad ideas out. And what my book is an attempt to understand the dynamics of these pink line politics, and not just to define the pink line as a geopolitical line between East and West, or between North and South, but to complicate that and see how the pink line actually runs through countries. runs through our own country, Shireen, in the huge difference between the incredibly progressive constitution we have and the terrible violence that faces particularly gender non-conforming queer people, femme men, butch lesbians, trans women on the ground. There's a pink line that runs through South Africa. There are pink lines that run, I would say, very importantly in this digital age, between the kind of freedom that anybody in the world might have in this globalized world, if they have one of these, and a little bit of broadband and some privacy, and the kind of world they can hook onto through this, a kind of globalized world with some dangers and risks, and we can talk about that, but a globalized world where they have access to a community of people who seem to be like them, to a whole language that's available to them, the language of LGBT, the language of transgender, all these languages, they can hook onto that. They can explore their identities in this way. Very powerfully, trans people can explore their identities online without having to put themselves in danger on the street. But there comes a point where you kind of cross a pink line between this online freedom and the offline strictures when you look up from your tablet or your device into the eyes of a punitive parent, into the eyes of a state that says you're a sinner, into the eyes, or a state that says what you're doing is a crime, into the eyes of a church that says you're a sinner, or a mosque that says you're a sinner. So there's an incredible complexity for people who live on the pink line. They're instrumentalized in these different ways by their own governments, by their own preachers, and by foreign governments and by foreign preachers. They have to toggle between some kind of online freedom and the offline strictures, as one of the people I write about says, when he's with his own kind behind closed doors, he can walk girly, but as soon as he goes into the street in Nairobi, he has to take on the sort of some sort of masculine affect, so that he's not identifiable as a queer. I want to understand what it means to live along the pink line, along this borderland. And so what my book does is it alternates chapters where in perhaps more theoretical or discursive chapters, I explore certain pink line themes, looking as well at how pink line politics changed through the course of the 7 or 8 years that I was researching this book, as the dial shifted, the culture wars dial shifted from the L and the G over to the T, and how pink line battles that were around homosexuality, for example, in North America, 15 or 20 years ago, are now about trans rights. I look at that in these chapters, but I alternate these chapters with very deep dives into the lived experiences of people on the ground in 10 countries all over the world that I identified as countries where there were pink line politics that were particularly acute. So the book begins in South Africa, where I tell the story of a transgender woman named Tuwonga Chimbalanga, who is a refugee from Malawi, where she was sentenced to 14 years hard labor because she dared to hold a public engagement ceremony with her fiance. I start there, I then move up into West Africa and tell a story about a young man named Michael Bashaija, who had the most terrible experiences as a child from within his own family, and who now actually lives in Canada, in Vancouver, where he's a refugee. I then moved to Egypt, where I tell the story of 2 lesbians who during the Arab Spring opened an extraordinary open-air sidewalk shisha cafe, which was the sort of hub of queer life in downtown Cairo. And then what happened to that when the coup happened and the military regime started instrumentalizing anti-gay politics. And from there I go into the world. I have a story about a transgender mother in Russia, about a group of kotis who define themselves as women's hearts and men's bodies in India, about a lesbian couple and their daughter in Guadalajara, Mexico, about an amazing group of LGBTQ kids from Ann Arbor, Michigan, just across the border. From queer to gay to trans to detransitioned, and I look at their journey over the course of 10 years, and to Israel and Palestine too, where I look at how the pink line in Israel is superimposed upon that country's really difficult national politics and the dynamics of pinkwashing. So that's the book in a nutshell. I'm happy to talk about it more in response to questions or comments from you and the others.
Thanks, Mark. That's quite a nutshell. Anne, I'm going to ask you to come in here. I know you have things to say about the method, but you also have things to say about the conceptual framing.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to everyone, and Shireen, to you for being the traffic conductor. We had a good little pre-conference, just for about 15 minutes, stirred up so many ideas. And Mark, I loved getting to read this book. As Shireen said, it's huge in scope, and you have done a great job of giving us a little brief summary, hard to do. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to engage in conversation. I should also note that my, for some reason, I can't rename myself to put my pronouns. So I just want to say, as is the custom in my country, that I use she, her pronouns, and I'm speaking from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. Again, situating myself as you did, I wanted to follow up on what you have just said by noting the challenge of this book. I was glad you mentioned the alternating chapters, because I do think that's one of the things that makes this so distinctive, that you move between these more conceptual or theoretical chapters to these stories of individual people and individual places. And you are a great storyteller, and I think you're clearly drawing on your skills as a journalist. But I was intrigued by Shireen's mention of memoir and the Dispatcher as a name for your method, because there's something of that flavor in there too. In your task of trying to tell other people's stories. And I want to hear more about it, because I see the concept of the pink line, as Shireen and you both mentioned, as a very powerful way to connect stories, but it also speaks about disjunctures, right? Borderlands, or like no-go zones, or ways that things don't cross, or you can cross over certain borders, but certainly many of the people you're speaking to would not be able to. And I think you do a great job of acknowledging the privilege of your own mobility to be able to move in and out of these places. But also, one of the things you've done is to dwell in them, that is to touch down long enough to not just be doing a kind of touristic approach to these stories. And that's wonderful. It speaks to the challenge of not universalizing, that is, not homogenizing the story, allowing for specificity of place, while also hewing to this notion of the pink line. For me, I'm really thinking about it in terms of both time and space, which is the title of one of your chapters. And, kind of old school Marxist notion of uneven development, of the way in which also in my view, kind of contra certain orthodox left theory, the revolution is never a punctual moment. It's always ongoing. It's always contradictory. It's always complicated. And nowhere do we see this more than in Africa, where we see the unevenness of decolonization, for sure, hopefully also colonization, or the the story that is, I'm the non-South African in this conversation, but there is a way in which perhaps this book could only have been written by a certain kind of South African with an interest in moving across boundaries that exist, as you say, very close at hand, right? From one neighborhood to the next, or from the city to the townships. So South Africa is a place whose geography has been crosshatched by various kinds of lines and borders. And those of us following that history from afar have also been very interested in the politics of apartheid and its dismantling, sort of. That too is a story of uneven development, tremendous optimism, and also political failure. It links up to more North American stories of the unfinished business of the abolition of slavery, the unfinished business of the civil rights movement, the unfinished business of an HIV/AIDS crisis, which is not over and has tilted into a pandemic. So much to say about these stories, but then I want to come back around to just what choices you made in order to avoid some of the potential pitfalls of homogenizing on the one hand, or an individual story that is not yours to tell. There's all of the critiques, for example, of ethnography. There can be problems with testimony, oral history. There's sort of questions of genre as well as method here. And I just want to say, I found your stories to be so interesting in terms of how they're written. I feel like there's certain things you're doing in order to make these have a complexity that I'm going to invite you to talk about that and the way in which those choices you made as a writer and as a researcher with those stories, I'm sure it was very, very difficult, might then address this question of the pink line as something that is about unevenness and difference, as well as global stories.
Before you go there, Mark, Jordache, you had a question too about language and stories, and I wonder if you want to bring that question in so Mark can pick up on both at the same time.
Hi everyone, it's so wonderful to be in such in the company of Shireen and Mark and Anne. I want to just thank Shireen for organizing this and Mark for sharing this wonderful, what I see as a labor of love to all of us, and to Anne for being part of this conversation also. So I do have, there's one thing that I just want to insert there around the pink line that Mark kind of brought up, but I think we need to complicate it a little, especially when we think about online sexual cultures that Mark referenced, and also when we think about what's happening in South Africa, we also have to think about race, and we also have to think about, in South Africa, for instance, when we think about gender non-conforming people and the violence that Black queer femme men experience, or even butch women, it is about race. It disproportionately affects LGBTIQ plus people within the Black community in South Africa. And I think that's important to also think about, like, what happens to the pink line when we start really thinking about the racial politics in certain spaces. And I also think online sexual cultures is another very important space to think about race, because although it offers a way to think about freedom and expression, but we come against racial logics continuously, the ways in which desire plays out, the ways in which bodies are privileged within these forums, falls back on the critiques around this kind of homogenous, normative, white, queer aesthetic, right? So I think like race starts complicating how we are thinking about this pink line within various spaces. So I think I will just quickly, I was very intrigued by the title, The Pink Line, and even the word frontier in the title of the book. And I thought it was very provocative to use both pink line and frontier. And for me, it evoked the current moment in a very different but related way. So when we think of line, we think of borders, we think of boundaries, national, racial, sexual, political, gender. And Mark, you kind of you kind of mentioned this in your comments also, and I immediately thought of Trump's border wall and the Mexican-US borderlands. And we also know, and we've mentioned this also, that lines, borders, walls, boundaries are porous, are permeable, and it's characterized by movement, right? Movement crossing between this side and that side of the wall, and oftentimes also for survival. And the other thing that I thought was so interesting in the book, in one of the stories, you showed how movement from one country to another often produces other borders and boundaries related to immigration status, which is also related to race and stuff like that, and limiting freedom and self-autonomy. And I think also most people, particularly ethnic, sexual, racial, gender minorities, and I think as South Africans, we know this very well, we live somewhere in the in-between space, right? In that interstitial space, for instance. And so in this expansive journey you take us on, one of the things I wondered was, like, if you could reflect also, and I think in relationship to the other question, if you could reflect on how you and your interlocutors negotiated this line. Did you encounter people or interlocutors who challenged you and resisted this concept of a pink line also? And if so, how did you negotiate it? And I wanted to ask if this concept shaped the book from the beginning, but I think that's apparent now. Yeah, those were some of my thoughts around the pink line and just like really complicating it even further.
So much there from both of you. Thank you. And thank you for your appreciation of the complexity of the concept. And I guess one of my privileges being a journalist rather than a scholar is I maybe don't need to be as rigorous as you would have to be about what a pink line is and how it works. So I can have the pink line shift shape and not have to have it. I can make a virtue of it being a kind of portmanteau in a way that serves different functions at different times of the book in a way that you might not be able to, and you of course are welcome to critique. I'm going to riff here, just some thoughts beginning with Jordache's comments about race. Of course, that I write in the book that so Tiwonga Chimbalanga, who is the transgender woman who's the refugee from Malawi, if I turn left and look across the bay now, I can't see it. I'm in Cape Town on False Bay. It's nighttime, but during the day, I can see across the bay, not 10 kilometers away from me as the crow flies, the township where Tiwonga, or as she's known as Auntie, lives. Now, I write in the book that every time I drive along the bay, my home in the largely white suburb of Cork Bay, to her home in the township, I'm crossing a pink line. On the one side of the pink line, I'm safe. And on the other side of the pink line, she is not. Now, why is that? We both live in a country that accords us, full rights and allegedly full protection. I'm safe because I'm a cisgender white man, a middle-class cisgender white man who drives in a car, and who lives in a house. So even if I want to fem it up and put some makeup or flap about a bit, I can do it in private. Auntie, who is a transgender woman and who does not have the ability that I do, if you like, to pass as straight, and who does not have her own transport or a wall around her home, has been attacked many, many times physically. Her body is a map of scars, and those attacks happened here in South Africa because she is a Black transgender woman. So yes, the lines of race and gender and sexuality track. Similarly, I think it's really important that you made the point you did about the sort of universalizing culture, online culture, which is actually a white middle class consumerist culture. And why that's important is because if you are a kid with a cell phone, a brown with a cell phone, and a gender non-conforming sense of yourself in South India, and you get online, what you're going to learn about your identity is something that got developed and that is being developed and is being kind of sold even as a commodity from the global north. And you're going to have to fit yourself, your brown, dark, queer, third gender self into that mold. And that is very complicated. And it's something that I hope I track in the book, that complexity. Now, it's complicated. It's also very generative in interesting ways. So one of the things I write about in the book is the way, like literally every single country I went to, I met somebody called Beyonce, somebody who called themselves Beyonce. And that was beautiful. And they all got this idea of Beyonce from, mainstream American showbiz commodity culture. Stuff I would imagine all of us on the seminar don't like. But what I found was so interesting is that why they chose Beyonce. And they chose Beyonce because of the way she represented fierceness, resistance, strength in a brown body, in a black body. And I was fascinated in the way these Beyoncés, whether they were in Uganda or India or Nigeria or the Philippines, indigenized Beyonce in ways that would be unrecognizable to Beyonce herself in the United States. So just to say that in response to your question, Jordache, there's more to say about borders and boundaries and how porous they are as well. But also, I think I'm going to use that observation of yours to sort of segue into Anne's very trenchant comment about my mobility. I mean, the book is called Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers. And I do have the power to cross those frontiers in a way that others don't, in a way that others really are trapped economically, politically, in the places where they are. And I think what's very important about, well, let me say a couple of things about my methodology, and that is that it comes this idea of a sort of biographical approach, I would say, and rather than an ethnographical approach, biographic rather than ethnographic approach, even though I think the two kind of connect, comes from my experiences as a South African journalist, particularly in our transition. And the job that I felt I had as a journalist to make sense of the transition we were going through in the 90s. And this idea that came to me through my journalism, that the best way to understand change is to sit on the shoulder of somebody who is either an agent of that change or perhaps just the consequence of that change, being buffeted around by that change, and to try and understand that change the way they understand it. And that is the best I can do as a journalist and a communicator. And the notion of working biographically comes from that, from trying to understand the story as it is lived by the queer people I write about on the Pink Line. But it's clearly a story that I tell. And as you mentioned, it's a very, I'm glad you found it well wrought, because it is very wrought. It's not an oral history that is just put on the page. I didn't turn a recorder on, let someone talk and give it to you in that way. I didn't say to someone, I don't want the book contract. You take the book contract and I will ghostwrite for you so that you can tell your story and have your name on the cover. I mean, my name is on the cover. And I needed to, I felt, understand what that meant. And that's for, I would say, narrative reasons and ethical reasons. And the narrative reasons, and I don't know whether I succeeded or not, you tell me. The narrative reasons are that if I am going to, and this is something I learned from journalism, if I'm going to be your guide through the swamp of life, through these tricky pink line waters, you will understand the journey better if you know who I am and where I'm coming from. And this is a kind of lesson from new journalism, not to be the omnipotent, omnipresent God's eye, but to kind of be in the story yourself as somebody walking a path, and to ask people to walk the path with you and to describe what you see along the way, as well as what other people are telling you they see. So that's the narrative prerogative. The ethical one is that the consequence of pink line politics is that queer people themselves lose their agency, that they're weaponized or instrumentalized, that they're told that they are foreign agents who have been corrupted by the West, by the secular West, that they're told that they are poor victims who need to be saved. And one of the key principles of my book is to acknowledge the agency of the people whose stories I tell in their own lives. And this meant understanding my own agency as well in the stories that are made. But not understanding my own agency in such a way that it becomes my story, because I don't want it to be my story. I'm a guide to these stories, an informed guide, a sensitive. I am the guide, right? And I want you to trust me as the guide. So what do I do in some key moments? And of course, that ethical prerogative is particularly sharp at the moment, given the debates around cultural appropriation, given the debates about who has the right to tell the story. So you asked me, Jordache, did I come up against anyone who not so much disagreed with me about the pink line, because it's not like I with these people talking about what the pink line is. I sat around with these people, looking at their lives and looking at how they lived their lives and hearing about their lives. But yes, in North America, one of the Ann Arbor kid who I thought was going to be my story, a young man named Liam, whom I met just before he underwent his gender confirmation surgery. When he was still a minor, he was 17 when I met him and interviewed him for the first time, with the full cooperation of his parents. And it was a story that absolutely entranced me, because his parents are a lesbian couple. And I was interested in what they represented. I loved the intergenerational story, like the pink line that his parents had to cross as pioneers in lesbian parenting, and then the pink line that their son was now crossing in coming out as trans. And Liam and I went down the road a fair bit, and I even published an essay about him. And then he decided he didn't want me to tell his story anymore. He wanted to tell his own story. He wasn't comfortable with me telling his story. And I mean, of course, he is empowered in ways that the Kotis I write about in South India are not. He's empowered to know that he can tell his own story. And he actually, at the time he decided he wanted to tell his own story, he became something of a social media superstar. And he didn't want or need me as a filter. So he fired me. And what was I going to do? We came to an agreement that I could write about anything that I'd already published before. He was happy with that agreement, and I was too, and so were his parents. But I had to stop following him. I had to stop following him and writing about what he became, which was a real sadness to me, because actually what he became is something magnificent, but it's not my story to tell. So I had to, that was one place where I was, where I came, not into conflict with somebody, but where somebody decided they didn't want me telling their story. There are other places where, you see, if I'm going to cross this pink line with my power and my privilege, I have to acknowledge that I'm a vector of the globalization that is actually diffusing this notion of LGBTQ rights globally. And whether I am or not, the other side thinks I am. So the other side thinks if I land in Uganda, the homophobic politicians and priests in Uganda think precisely that I'm coming with my money to turn their innocent folk, their innocent children, into queers. Now, when I do land in Kampala or in a village in South India, or in a working class shisha bar in Cairo, it is true. I have my computer with ideas in my backpack, and I have my wallet in my pocket, and I'm perceived in that way. So I need to understand myself as part of the dynamics of the pink line. And there are a couple of instances where I do. So with Michael Bashaija, the Ugandan kid whom I met, I met him very soon after he had been violently entrapped and sexually assaulted through Facebook by a man who was offering to help him. And he was 17 at the time. He had been chucked out of home. He was homeless. And he was really messed up. And I started talking to him and connecting with him. And I saw a young man who was incredibly brave and who had who had possibilities in life if he could get on the right track. And when people in Uganda started passing the hat around to put him on the right track by sending him to school, a boarding school, it was a no-brainer. I contributed. Not huge amounts of money, a lot of money for him, not huge amounts of money for me. I didn't want him to find out about this, but he did. And suddenly overnight, our relationship changed. I was no longer an empathetic but disinterested outsider. I was a benefactor. And I became kind of overnight a big brother or a father figure too. This from a kid whose father had thrown him out of his home because he was queer. And it became very complicated. He had spent already a couple of years on the street. He had to be a hustler. And I was getting hustled as well. And I had to reckon with that. And I didn't just want to reckon with it in engagement with him. I felt I needed to write about it so that you could read it too. So that I could implicate myself in what was going on. I don't think I necessarily always did that as well as I could have or should have. But it was definitely an approach I took. And I'm not sure whether, I feel like I've spoken for too long, and I'm not sure whether I have addressed what were your specific thoughts about the general and the specific. But I'm going to leave it there for now because I think I've spoken enough.
Oh, thanks, Mark. That was a little bit of a masterclass in some ways on method. So thank you for that, because we don't often get to talk about in a human way about methodology. We kind of, we smooth it out and we talk about snowball samples and all these ridiculous terms, but all of us working with other people, telling other people's stories, have to contend with this complicated place you found yourself in. And I was struck reading the book actually at how upfront you were about, as we would say in feminism, your positionality.
Yeah.
I didn't think you disappeared yourself at all in this, and it kind of reflected very often on your power to cross boundaries, to say things, to do things So, you know, it was exemplary in that sense. So I think this discussion was really also useful, and I hope also something we'll take away and think about in our own work. So Jordache, I want to hand it back to you because I know you had other questions, and I've become so entranced by the conversation that I've kind of forgotten where you were wanting to go with this. But let me just pass it on to you. Yeah.
Okay, so I will ask my long question about language, because I think it also ties into everything that we are talking about. And I tend to read my questions, it keeps me on track. So throughout the book, like one of the things I really liked and I really appreciated, and I think it was one of the things that I was like, this is so interesting, where you pay attention to the politics of language itself. So as queer becomes like a global brand, right, where Western expressions, articulations, and understanding threaten local and indigenous formations. We see the role of NGOs and human rights organizations crafting new identitarian categories by relying on indigenous and local languages as part of their campaigns to target vulnerable populations. And here I'm specifically thinking of the chapters on the Koti category that emerges as an identitarian category at a particular moment in the service of public health discourse, right? Then we also have the case study of Auntie, who I just fell in love with Auntie, like I want to meet her now, who encounters herself as trans in a South African township, right? And that is like, I think we need to just pause and ponder this. As a word and a concept, trans is unfamiliar to her. And there's a narrative that transitioning is about survival. And so part of the question is like, I'm wondering about the violence embedded in that very logic, right? But I'm also thinking about Marwan, the Palestinian man who appears in the story about Fadi and Navad. And to quote, and I want to quote from page 277, where you write, quoting them, it felt easier for me to do the sin in Hebrew, a foreign language, not to have it in your own house, your own language. Hebrew was the language not just of sin and oppression, but also confusingly of possibility, even liberation. And when I read that page, and I went back to that page a couple of times, I kept thinking to myself, what does it mean to dream, to fuck, to feel, to desire, and to create pleasure in another language or even across languages, right? Because there's something like really interesting happening here about language. So I was just wondering if you could reflect on language as you move from country to country, countries with very different geo-histories of colonialism, imperialism, socialism, capitalism. What importance do your different interlocutors place on language to understand sexuality differently, to disrupt the gender sexual order of the West, you know, read as modern? But also let's complicate it further, because even as local indigenous concepts become codified, this is a very imperialist gesture, right? With the rise of human rights discourses and NGOs, we see the proliferation of categories, the ordering of people, the insertion into modern regimes of gender and sexuality is about a particular order of things, like if we have to reference Foucault. You know, and this goes back to the ordering of animals, fauna, flora, species. This is the afterlife of colonialism. And I'm wondering about this proliferation of categories, but also even as language shifts and language changes and people become creative with even how they understand indigenous languages as it comes up against these more, the global gay brand, right? The transnational. I found like there's creativity there, like the things people were doing and the ways in which they were understanding language and oppression and colonialism and settler colonialism. I just thought it was fascinating. And that was one of the things I really appreciated about this entire book. Yeah, so I don't know if you have any thoughts about language.
Listen, I mean, there's so much to say. I mean, I don't know where to begin. It's a completely. I really, really, really love what you've just said in terms of your how you've riffed on what I was trying to do with the book. I mean, let's just very quickly a couple of case studies or from the book. Let's look at Auntie. Auntie begins life in a village outside of modernity, where even though she has a boy's body, she's permitted to play the role of girl because she's raised by her uncle, who's a chief, whose wife has left him and who doesn't have girl children, and who needs someone to do the cleaning and cooking. So he's perfectly happy for her to be a girl because it suits him in his patriarchal system. But she's a girl. And if anybody doesn't respect her as a girl, they're going to get fined a couple of chickens. And this happens once or twice. Auntie leaves there. She leaves there and she goes to the city. And in the city, thinking of herself as a girl, she finds a boy, a guy, and she decides she's going to marry him. And in deciding she's going to marry him, because if in Chichewa culture, you marry someone, you have to have an engagement ceremony. An engagement ceremony is a way of, getting stuff so that you've got the means to start your life together. So she has this engagement ceremony and she goes big. She goes so big with some collusion from a businesswoman who wants to make some money off this engagement ceremony. She goes so big that the press finds about it and reports on it and publishes a headline story saying gays engage. Suddenly, Auntie, a girl, has become gay in the city. And because she's become gay, she's committed a crime. So she's sent to jail, right? She's never heard the word gay before. She's sent to jail because she's gay. She's finally released from jail because there's an international campaign for her release. Ban Ki-moon even comes to Malawi. Madonna sends out a petition because she's got Malawian adopted children. She's released, and it's decided by the international NGOs who are helping her that she's no longer safe in Malawi and that she needs to go to South Africa because South Africa is a safe place. And the way she's going to get to South Africa is by claiming that she has fear of persecution in Malawi because she's trans. She's never heard the word trans before. She arrives in South Africa, and the organization that's been given money by Amnesty International to look after her is an amazing organization called Gender Dynamics, which is a trans rights organization. So suddenly Auntie has to be trans, right? She is the same person. She's a woman. She's a woman. She's always been a woman. She always will be a woman. But in these different places, she has to take on different identities. And interestingly, I mean, it would be nice to say, nice to be kind of what my friend Rahul Rao, his wonderful book, recent book, would nice to be Afro-romantic and say she should have just stayed in her village, but she didn't stay in her village. Why didn't she stay in her village? Because it really wasn't that comfortable being a girl in a boy's body in the village, right? So she doesn't really fit in anywhere. I don't want us to be Afro-romantic about this. So that's the one little example. The other one that I think is really interesting, and it has implications in India too, but I'll talk about it in the Philippines, where as in many parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia, there have always been third gender categories that historically, as in North America, were related to something supernatural, to having some kind of shamanistic or priestly role. But in the colonial era, when Christianity stamped that all out, the third gender people in the Philippines, Bakla, took on the roles very cherished of the in the beauty industry. So every Filipina woman has her favorite Bakla hairdresser. Every Filipino neighborhood has an annual Bakla beauty pageant. They're loved. Bakla are loved. But there are very few things they can do in society. They can be in the beauty industry, they can be hairdressers, they can be beauty queens. along comes a middle-class movement of trans women who, using an identity that is biomedical, that involves medical transition, and that is rights-based, call themselves transgender and see themselves as women, not bakla. And this movement of transgender women, one of whom is actually now a congresswoman in the Philippines, sees bakla as some kind of false consciousness, as people who are in a kind of muddy middle. And if they would just step over into womanhood and embrace their womanhood, they would be free. The sky could be their limit. They could become politicians, captains of industry, teachers, policewomen, whatever, rather than having to be hairdressers. And there's actually some truth to that, if you have the means to transition in that way. The process, this kind of gender spectrum, because bakla can be anything. Jordache, you and me are bakla, but someone else is bakla if they have breasts and makeup and wear traditionally feminine clothing. Bakla is a whole range of things, right? But what's happened due to this Western biomedical rights-based identity is that what was a spectrum has now become more binary. You cross over from masculinity to femininity. And very interestingly, I interview a really wonderful Filipino-American writer named Meredith Talusan, whose memoir, albino Filipino-American writer, whose memoir is model, she's a model too. It's really worth reading. And she says that she came to Harvard as an undergraduate in the 90s. And she says that if she had stayed in the Philippines, she probably wouldn't have transitioned. She would have somehow made bakla work for her. But because she arrived in a society in the 90s, where there are men and women, and she wasn't a man, she became a woman, right? It's very interesting how North American society has shifted in the intermediate 20 years, and how there is now a sense of gender queerness and the spectrum and non-binary identity. And one of the things Meredith and I discussed is that if she'd made landfall in the United States 20 years later, would she have transitioned to femininity, or would she have found herself a non-binary identity the way younger people do now? Anyway, two thoughts coming out of your reading of language and identity categories in particular.
It's very interesting the way in which you answered. You answered that, because this is you address the theoretical through the stories in such a powerful way, that to show the fluidity of these concepts themselves, and the way in which they get constructed, used, transmuted by different actors. And Anne, I'm going to just move over to you to ask your question now, which will be the last question, I think, from the panel, because I do want to give the rest of the people in the audience a chance to say something or ask a question. So, and Femi has put details of the book in the chat, so please buy the book so writers can keep writing. Anne.
I know I have to compress. I was thinking probably just one more round, what to choose. I'll just say to the audience, I had a question about theory, a question about transculture wars, and a question about It Gets Better. And I don't want to muddle things by trying to combine them. But Mark, since I gave you a preview, maybe you'll just take what I say as provocation. But building off what you just said, you have actually addressed some of my interest in the specificity of transculture wars in the Americas, but the way that it links up and can be usefully contextualized by the work you've done. And I'm wanting to ask you about, I love the humility of your answer about how we get to tell stories. And I appreciated, though, that you said, but I put my name on the book. I did write these stories. And one of the tools you bring is the conceptual tool of theory. I really appreciated seeing, for example, John D'Amelio's Capitalism and Gay Identity still useful, right? Partly because it provides capitalism as a context, which easily also can incorporate colonialism as a broad historical context in which to continue to understand gender and sexual politics. The question of the moral panic coming from a range of sources, but Gail Rubin, I think, is perennially useful for the way in which we are still seeing culture wars that are affectively driven by panic, whether it's the debates right now over critical race studies in the curriculum, or the bathroom debates, or Judith Butler as a household word. You know, I have to say, I sat through Texas state legislature debates about bathroom politics and took it as something of a victory that people were decrying the fact that children were being taught that gender is a social construct in middle school, that we were going to hell in a handbasket. I just felt like, I guess that's some success for us. So I did want to give you a chance to talk about how theory helps you. And I do think theory can be affectively driven, that is, we respond to it affectively. And so I will try to segue, this may not work or not, Mark, and you can, take this as you will, segue also to my question about I wanted to make sure you addressed your final, I don't know if you called it an epilogue, I've got the TOC here, but about the It Gets Better politics, and the way in which I think you're critical of that. I am too. I didn't like Dan Savage's campaign. I was probably part of the naysayers, but it's because I work in the domain of mixed affect and the way in which it's always important to pay attention to the places where it doesn't get better. I think this is really something we're confronting right now, and that acknowledging that can actually be a way to feel better. So not looking for neat closure on, for example, these stories you tell of people who are continuing to struggle, whom you have sporadic contact with, and you can't always help them because the issues they confront are structural, have to do with systemic racisms, have to do with pandemic and so on. So yeah, anything you want to say about kind of the affective power of your book as it links to the conceptual tools you've given us, and kind of where does it leave us? Where do you go? Where do we go? You're really, really, I think, interestingly open about the ambitions you have for this book to do some work in the world. And in fact, this conversation is a good example of how productive indeed it can be.
Look, I feel like when I write a book like this, I'm doing a PhD kind of without having to, without a supervisor problem, but also without having to write the horrible review chapter that has been, the bane of so many of my friends' lives. So it was just, but I don't actually start with theory, and I didn't actually start with the concept of the pink line. I started with trying to understand what the impact was of this new global conversation. And with the help of an Open Society Fellowship, going to countries where there was a particular impact, where the conversation was particularly sharp. And then out of that came the pink line, and out of that came the readings. And in fact, it began with Arjun Appadrai and readings on globalization, because I wanted to understand. I'd never really thought about the vectors of globalization before. So that's where it began. Where it ends is with my critique of It Gets Better. And I'm not a novelist. I wish I was, but I don't have the confidence to create a whole fictional world. And the people I wrote about, like, shit happened to them that I just wish hadn't have happened to them. I really wish Michael Bashaija had not left Kampala and been persuaded by some pizza delivery man, benefactor, American, reborn Christian benefactor in Arizona, that he would be saved if he came to North America. And I watched it happen in real time. And I couldn't do anything about it because it's not my story. But I really wish it hadn't happened. It did happen. Now he's on his feet in Vancouver, I think. But he hasn't been on his feet. And I really wish that Zaira and Martha didn't get divorced in Guadalajara, and that Fadi and Nadav didn't get divorced. I wish that that Pasha had got custody, the transgender woman in Russia, had got custody or visitation rights to her child. And because she kind of overstepped the mark against the advice of her lawyers, she lost all access to her child. And I could do nothing about that. And I understand why she overstepped the mark. If I were in her shoes, I would have done so too. The point is that I couldn't give you guys a happy ending to these stories. And I think that's okay, because as Anne says, there isn't one. And this fantasy, it gets better, is a complicated fantasy. I mean, I feel like I can say to younger queer people struggling, it gets better if they can find the tools needed to deal with the reality that faces them, rather than because there's this kind of sweep coming from the West, which is going to sort of wave a magic wand over the world and make everywhere in the world queer friendly. And my big critique of the it gets better narrative is around temporality, which is something else I get from theory and from theorists who've written about it. And that is, and I'm thinking here of queer theorists like Neville Hode and like Rahul Rao, but also people like Jasbir Puar. And the problem with the it gets better narrative is that it posits a place in the future that resembles Amsterdam or San Francisco or Toronto, and a place in the past that is Kampala or Moscow or Chennai. And it suggests that getting better, that those places are behind us. Those places are behind us if we live in the global north. And the problem with that, of course, is that then you become a savior, rather than having the ability to look at the place you're in with all its complexity and see what's actually happening there. Understand the richness of Bakla, even if it has its limitations, and understand the possibilities in a kind of pre-colonial African village, even if that village is still governed by patriarchy, which requires certain gender roles. So yeah, that's where my critique of It Gets Better comes from, is the sort of arrogance that it would give most of us sitting on this call when we look at other parts of the world.
Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism comes into play here as well, doesn't it, in thinking about that. But we have 2 questions so far, so I'm going to ask both of them to ask it in turn. Judith Van Allen, historian, Cornell, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark. I've always learned from all your books, and I'm glad to have read them. I feel like I'm asking an old-fashioned question, but I'm going to do it anyway. So a few years ago, I saw a very interesting map of Africa that mapped laws about gay sexuality onto French versus British colonial areas. And of course, all the British ones matched with the bad contemporary laws, and the French ones matched with much more progressive contemporary laws. So as a practicing political historian, even though I was trained as a political theorist, so I don't always do what historians think you should do either, and sometimes journalist. I'm very interested in the long story, and plus all the work that you and others have done about pre-colonial and colonial Africa that showed a wide range of practices and acceptance and roles and all kinds of things that seem to have gotten compressed in response to the gay rights movement, or to, you know, to the whole revolution. Does that make sense to you? That, you know, it's like as though we could tolerate more of that diversity in the history as well as maybe in the societies, as long as they were under the radar, but that the whole opening up of this discourse of sexuality then brings things into public view and question and pressure that before could just be lived without being attacked, essentially.
I mean,
because so much of what you talk about is about this bringing things into view, and then they're treated differently, and people are treated differently.
Thank you, Judith. I mean, I think that there are two ideas there that are important. The first is, of course, that this notion of prescription around sexual behavior was something brought to Africa by the colonizer with the Bible and the law book hand in hand. And there is, of course, the irony of saying that of using those penal codes, which are colonial hangovers from Britain, using them to claim that homosexuality is un-African. And of course, that is a particular legacy of British colonialism. The French Revolution legalized consensual sex between consenting adults. So Francophone Africa doesn't have those problems legally, which doesn't mean that there isn't homophobia in Francophone Africa. And in fact, there's terrible documented violence against suspected homosexuals in the Cameroon and in Senegal. And the reason for that comes to, I think, your second observation, which is what happens in societies where things are spoken about in a way that they weren't previously. And the precursor to a gay rights movement in this case is, of course, the AIDS epidemic. And the observation, the funding that was channeled to countries in Africa and South Asia and other parts of the world to facilitate conversations about sex so that the epidemic could be fought. And the epidemic was actually fought very effectively in this way. But in the process, because of the understanding that a key population is homosexuals and that you can't reach when they're underground, it became a precept of the AIDS movement, which intersected very well with the growing LGBT rights movement, that gay people had to come out and make spaces that would attract other gay people where they could get safer sex messages. And what was previously on the down low and a behavior now became something public and an identity. And an identity identities are mobilized in certain ways, right? And once the behavior became an identity, it became the identity of what was in effect a political minority claiming rights within systems where people are subjects, as Mamdani has shown us, rather than citizens. So any group of people in civil society claiming rights become a threat to the status quo, which is one of the reasons why the Ugandans came down so heavy on gay people, on queer people and LGBT people, because they were taken to the streets and asking to be given rights in a society where the state decides who gets rights, not the people. So all of that created a certain kind of social and political crisis, which has led to the homophobic politics of the Pink Line.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Belinda Dodson, geographer, editor of the Canadian Journal of African Studies.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Mark and other panelists. That was wonderful. As a geographer, I really love the kind of spatial geopolitical aspect of your talk. I haven't read the book yet, but I hope to, and I'm looking forward to it. My question, though, is about migration and mobility. When you started out your talk this afternoon, it was very much, I spoke to this person in this place and that person in that place, but as the discussion unfolded, there was more and more about mobility from a village to a city or from one country to another. I mean, is there more of that in the book? But also another question, was there also a kind of aspirational mobility that one day I might be able to move somewhere else where I will be able to be myself more fully?
Yes, very, very much. You know, I didn't necessarily, as in the case of Michael, expect people to move, but when they moved, I followed them. So I landed up following Michael to Vancouver, even though I didn't make it to Vancouver myself. I followed Maha and Amira from Cairo to Amsterdam. I watched as the Kotis in a small village in a small fishing village in rural Tamil Nadu gained the social and political capital to go to the city, and what happened when that happened. I think my most poignant story about the aspirational part of it is the story of a man whose name I can't remember because I use a pseudonym for him. So forgive me for not remembering his name. Jordache, if you remember it, you'll jump in. So a Palestinian man who lives in Ramallah, who dreams of the Mediterranean, not because, as you might expect, it is the land of his forefathers and he wants to go back to his grandmother's house in Yafa or Haifa, but because he has this fantasy that he can be free as a gay man if he gets to Tel Aviv. But of course, he can't get to Tel Aviv because he lives in the occupied territories. So he has an Israeli Jewish boyfriend, and they make a plan that he will apply to go and see a cardiologist in East Jerusalem. And with that pass that he gets to East Jerusalem, they'll sneak across to Tel Aviv where he'll see the sea, you know, maybe go to a gay nightclub or to like have some fun, be able to be himself. But what happens is that for reasons that aren't really clear to me, somewhere along the way, he and his boyfriend get picked up by the police and interrogated, and the Shin Bet get involved, Shin Bet being the Israeli security apparatus, intelligence, and discover that he is a student at the university and that he has an Israeli Jewish boyfriend, and basically turns him by blackmailing him, tries to turn him by blackmailing him, by saying, if you don't inform on what's going on at your university, we are going to let your family know in Nablus that you have an Israeli Jewish boyfriend. The young man has really what is in effect a nervous breakdown. It so happens that his Israeli Jewish boyfriend is also Canadian. They come to South Africa to get married because it's the one place they can get married. With his Jordanian passport, he can get to South Africa, and he now lives in Toronto. But that is the story of thought, of what happens, of the power and the danger of these aspirations, and of mobility, or the attempt to cross borders, and the fantasy of what might lie on the other side.
Maybe another book.
I'm sure there's another book brewing, Mark.
There's always another.
There's always another book brewing. We've sadly run out of time. I think we could actually all go on talking for quite a bit longer. But let me thank Jordache and Anne for their contributions, and thank you so much, Mark, for giving us this book, for being here and being willing to talk to all of us. And I hope it wins a prize. So good luck with that. Why not? I mean, it certainly is a prize-worthy book. It's very much on my mind, of course, as we see, the Booker and the Nobel being awarded to people on our continent. I think prizes seem to be in our heads at the moment, but prize or no prize, thank you for a rich and moving book and for sharing all these stories with us. And thank you everyone for coming.
Shireen, thank you so much, and thanks for everyone for coming. I've put my email address into the chat, and I really do love engagement and dialogue with the ideas of this book, and would be more than happy to communicate with anyone who wants to carry on the conversation in that way. Excellent.
Well, we'll leave it on for a minute as everyone leaves, but thank you all. And we'll see you next week for a discussion about music and Blackness in Morocco. So if you're free, come then.
Thank you, Shireen.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. That was fantastic. Loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
well, thank you too for doing such a great job.
yeah.
And for our flexible approach to the event. And yeah, so I'm going to close this now. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.